In the spring of 1934, a Bureau of Engraving and Printing employee named Walter Crane reported for his regular shift at the printing facility on 14th Street in Washington, D.C., and found that his entire production section had been reassigned overnight. No memo, no supervisor briefing, the floor he had worked for 11 years. The section responsible for intaglio plate preparation for Series A currency was locked behind a door that required a new key he had not been issued. His timecard station had been moved. 14 of his colleagues had been similarly displaced. When Crane asked his floor supervisor, a man named George Pollard, who had managed that section for 9 years, what had happened, Pollard told him he had received orders from the assistant director of the Bureau 2 days earlier and was not authorized to discuss them. Crane kept a personal journal. He had kept one every year since 1919. The entry for that morning, March 6, 1934, runs to 4 pages. The first thing he wrote was that the locked section remained locked for 17 days. The second thing he wrote was that when it reopened, every plate, every proof sheet, and every document associated with the previous design series had been removed, and the men who had worked inside during those 17 days were transferred to a facility in Fort Worth, Texas, and did not return. That journal sat in a cardboard box in Crane's daughter's attic in Silver Spring, Maryland, for 58 years. In 1992, she donated it, along with 43 other boxes of her father's papers, to the Library of Congress. The finding aid for the collection was entered into the library's catalog system. The journal volume covering 1934 is listed. It has never been digitized. When a researcher named David Shine requested access to that specific volume in 2004 as part of a study on Federal Reserve printing history, the library's reading room staff informed him that the box containing the 1934 volume had been flagged for conservation review. It remained under conservation review for the duration of his research fellowship. He noted this in the acknowledgments of his unpublished manuscript. The manuscript has never been published. Walter Crane was not a conspiracy theorist. He was not a man with a political motive. He was a skilled engraving technician who had worked for the same government agency for 11 years, kept meticulous records of everything he observed, and wrote down what he saw, because that was what he did. What he saw in March of 1934 was one of 3 documented moments in the 20th century when the design of the American $1 bill was changed in ways that were never publicly announced, never explained to Congress in open session, and never described in any official press release issued by the Treasury Department or the Federal Reserve. Before we go further, if you find these buried investigations as fascinating as I do, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research unless you tell it otherwise. Now, back to what Walter Crane saw. To understand what happened in that locked section in 1934, we have to go back further than the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. We have to go back to a decades-long argument about what the American dollar was supposed to represent, an argument that was never resolved publicly, that moved instead into the design of the currency itself, and that left its fingerprints on the paper in your wallet in ways that most Americans have never been told to look for. The history most people were taught about dollar bill design is administrative. New series are issued periodically. Security features are updated. The Treasury makes announcements. The public barely notices. What that version of history leaves out is that the iconographic content of the American dollar, the symbols, the seals, the Latin phrases, the specific numerology embedded in the arrangement of stars and arrows and olive branches, was not selected by committee, was not approved by any democratic process, and was never explained to the American public when it was placed there. Congress did not vote on the imagery. No public comment period was held. The Federal Register contains no entry in which a Treasury official describes the symbolic reasoning behind any element of the reverse design. The three secret redesigns were not primarily about security features. They were about meaning. Each one removed something and added something else. And the men who made those decisions left almost no public record of why, and in at least one case, took active steps to ensure that record would not survive them. The first secret redesign happened in 1933 and 1934, the period Walter Crane documented. The official history acknowledges a currency redesign in 1935, when the $1 silver certificate received the reverse design that Americans still carry today: the two circular seals, the unfinished pyramid, the eye above it, the eagle, the Latin phrases. What the official history does not acknowledge is the design iteration that preceded the 1935 version and that never went to public circulation. A currency historian named James Laughlin, writing in a 1967 academic paper on Federal Reserve Series transitions published in the Journal of Economic History, identified what he called a pre-release proof series from 1933 that differed from the 1935 final design in three specific ways. The pyramid appeared without the eye above it. The reverse carried a different Latin phrase in the position now occupied by annuit coeptis, one that Laughlin declined to reproduce in his paper, but described as having Masonic organizational rather than providential meaning. And the serial numbering system used a prefix that does not correspond to any publicly documented series code in the Federal Reserve's official record of issues. Laughlin's paper requested that researchers interested in examining the proof specimens contact the Bureau of Engraving and Printing's historical collection. When subsequent researchers made that contact in 1971 and again in 1988, the Bureau reported no proof specimens from 1933 in its historical holdings. The symbolism that did make it onto the 1935 dollar was not selected casually or quickly. The unfinished pyramid with its floating eye above, the reverse of the Great Seal of the United States, had existed as a government symbol since 1782. But it had never appeared on circulating currency in the 152 years between its adoption and its placement on the dollar bill in 1935. Dozens of currency designs had come and gone in those 152 years. The seal had always been available. It had never been used. The decision to finally place it there in 1934 and 1935 was made by Henry Morgenthau, Jr., the Secretary of the Treasury, and by Henry Wallace, the Secretary of Agriculture, acting on a direct recommendation from a man named Nicholas Roerich, a Russian-born mystic, painter, philosopher, and esotericist who had no official government position of any kind, and whose influence over Wallace during this period was substantial enough that Wallace wrote him personal letters addressing him as Dear Guru. Those letters were later obtained by a journalist named Westbrook Pegler and used in an attempt to derail Wallace's 1948 presidential campaign. They became known as the Guru Letters. Wallace never fully explained them and never gave a complete public account of Roerich's role in the dollar redesign. Roerich, for his part, left the United States in 1935 under a cloud of financial irregularities related to a government-funded expedition to Asia he had led at Wallace's request. He never returned. He died in India in 1947. His personal papers, which reportedly included correspondence with Wallace about American currency, remain in the Nicholas Roerich Museum in New York City, where access to the correspondence files requires a formal application that is evaluated case by case. Morgenthau's diary, which he kept in meticulous detail and which runs to nearly 900 volumes now held at the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library, contains entries for every week of 1934, except a gap of 31 days between late February and late March. the exact period covering Walter Crane's locked section, and the 17 days of restricted access at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. The second secret redesign occurred between 1963 and 1965. This one is documented in pieces, across sources that have never been assembled into a single account. In November of 1963, President John F. Kennedy signed Executive Order No. 1110, which is accurately described in the historical record but almost universally mischaracterized in its significance. The order dealt with the authority to issue silver certificates and is frequently cited in connection with Kennedy's assassination in ways that serious historians have dismissed. What is less discussed, and what the dismissal of the conspiracy framing has helped bury, is what happened to currency design policy in the 14 months following that order, separate from any question of assassination, and documented in the Treasury's own internal files. A Treasury Department internal memorandum dated February 1964, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request filed in 1997 by a monetary historian named G. Edward Griffin and partially released with significant redactions, described an ongoing symbolic content review of Federal Reserve note design being conducted by a working group whose membership was not disclosed, that included no elected officials, no public representatives, and no members of Congress or their staff. The memorandum referenced a design modification to the $1 note that had been approved at the working group's November 1963 meeting, the same week as Kennedy's assassination, and that would be implemented in the Series 1963B printing run. The modification is described in the memorandum only as seal positioning adjustment, reference file 7C. No other detail is given. The reference file 7C has never been located despite multiple FOIA requests over a period of 20 years. Series 1963B notes differ from their immediate predecessors in ways that numismatic collectors and plate analysts have observed and cataloged, but that the Bureau of Engraving and Printing has never officially itemized, acknowledged, or explained in any document available to the public. The third secret redesign is the most recent and the least documented. It occurred between 1995 and 1999, during the period of the last major security overhaul of American currency. The public redesign of the $20, $50, and $100 bills during this period was extensively covered in the press and carefully explained by Treasury officials in congressional testimony and public briefings. The $1 bill was not redesigned in this cycle. Officially, the Treasury stated publicly that no changes were being made to the $1 note. But a paper published in 2001 by two researchers at the American Numismatic Society, Dr. Robert Van Ryzen, and a plate analyst named Carl Carlson, examined microprinting characteristics and intaglio plate surface signatures across a sample of 340 Series 1995 and Series 1999 $1 notes. Their methodology involved high magnification scanning of plate characteristic marks that are unique to individual engraved plates, marks that persist through the life of a plate and change only when the plate is re-engraved rather than simply replaced. Replacement reproduces the existing design. Re-engraving changes it, at whatever scale the engraver chooses. Van Ryzen and Carlson identified 17 discrete differences in the intaglio plate characteristics of the reverse design between the two series. Differences that could not be accounted for by normal plate wear, normal plate replacement, or the printing tolerances documented in the Bureau's own technical specifications. They concluded that the reverse plate had been re-engraved during the 1995 to 1999 period. They could not determine which of the 17 differences constituted intentional design modifications versus incidental variation. The Bureau of Engraving and Printing, when contacted for comment, stated that all plate work on the $1 note during this period was routine maintenance. Van Ryzen and Carlson noted this response in their published conclusion and described it as non-responsive to their specific findings, which concerned plate surface signatures rather than the Bureau's internal classification of the work performed. The paper appeared in the American Numismatic Society's monograph series. It has been cited 4 times in 23 years. It has never been cited by any government source. The Bureau of Engraving and Printing has never provided a complete public account of every design change made to the $1 note since 1935. It has never explained why the 1933 proof series, identified by James Laughlin in 1967, does not appear in its official historical holdings. It has never explained what was contained in Treasury Reference File 7C, described in the 1964 Internal Memorandum as the authorization document for the Series 1963B modification. It has never explained why Henry Morgenthau's diary contains a 31-day gap covering exactly the period of the 1934 locked section incident at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. Why did the Great Seal's pyramid and eye wait 152 years to appear on circulating currency? And why was the decision to place it there made by officials who were taking design guidance from a man with no government role? Why does the Bureau of Engraving and Printing's own historical archive contain no record of proof specimens from the design period that its own staff, documented in Walter Crane's journal, spent 17 days producing behind a locked door? Why would a routine security overhaul in the late 1990s, the most extensively documented currency redesign in American history, leave the $1 note's reverse plate, re-engraved in 17 measurable ways, with no public announcement and a response to academic inquiry that its own authors described as non-responsive? These questions do not go away because institutions refuse to answer them. But here is what makes the third redesign different from the first 2. The 2001 numismatic paper was not the first time researchers had identified unexplained plate characteristics in Federal Reserve note design. A report compiled in 1978 by the House Subcommittee on Domestic Monetary Policy, a congressional oversight body that no longer exists, having been quietly abolished in a 1995 House committee restructuring that received almost no press coverage, examined what the report called undisclosed design modifications to Federal Reserve notes across 3 separate series spanning the 1950s and 1960s. The subcommittee, which had the statutory authority to request records from the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, concluded after a 14-month review that the Bureau had, on at least 2 documented occasions, made changes to note design without notifying the relevant Congressional Oversight Committee as required under the terms of the Currency Act. The report described this as a violation of the oversight framework. It recommended a formal audit to determine the scope and content of all design changes made to Federal Reserve notes since 1933 that had not been publicly disclosed. The audit was never conducted. The subcommittee itself was restructured out of existence 17 years later in 1995. The same year, the third secret redesign reportedly began. Its archived files, covering 17 years of monetary oversight work, were transferred to the House Financial Services Committee. A researcher who requested access to the files specific to Federal Reserve note design in 2008 was informed that they were under review for archival processing. The last documented attempt to access those files was made in 2019. They remained under review. Walter Crane's daughter, when she donated her father's papers to the Library of Congress in 1992, included a handwritten note with the 1934 journal volume. The note said her father had asked her, twice across the span of his final decade, not to destroy it. He had never told her what was in it. She had never read it. She thought it was a record of his work. She was right. He died in 1971 at the age of 81, having worked for the Bureau of Engraving and Printing for 34 years until his retirement in 1957, having been promoted 4 times, having received a commendation for his work on the series' 1950 printing run, and having never, in any interview, any surviving letter, or any public statement, described what he observed in March of 1934. He kept the copy of the receiving log he had been handed in 1934 alongside his 1934 journal. When his daughter looked for it after his death, it was not among his papers. The note she left in 1992 mentions it. She said she had not been able to find it. The journal is still in the box. The box is still under conservation review at the Library of Congress. The note is still clipped to the outside. The currency in your wallet has been through 3 design processes that the government has never publicly explained. The symbols on the back of the $1 bill were placed there by officials who were consulting a Russian mystic with no government role, in a process that left a 31-day hole in the diary of the Secretary of the Treasury. Following 17 days during which the production floor where the plates were being prepared was locked to its own staff. 2 subsequent redesigns, one authorized by a working group with no public membership record, one documented only by a plate analysis paper cited 4 times in 2 decades, completed a pattern of change that was never announced, never legislated, and never explained. You have been carrying it your entire life. The people who put those symbols there never once told you what they meant to them, or why they chose that moment to finally put them there after 152 years of not doing so. These stories survive because people refuse to stop asking. If this matters to you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. History does not disappear when it is buried. It disappears when no one looks for it. Next week, I am pulling a thread that connects the $1935 bill design directly to a private dinner that took place in New York City in June of 1934. 5 men attended. 3 of them are in the official historical record. 2 of them are not. One of those 2 was a printing plate engraver. The other held a position at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York that was never listed in any public staff directory. The notes from that dinner were found in a private estate sale in Connecticut in 2009. You will not want to miss it.